Okay, so welcome everybody to this is actually our fourth heart-to-heart conversation, and it's about increasing diverse representation of women in education and in leadership. And these heart-to-heart conversations started because Kyra, who's in part of Women Ed Spain, she's in Barcelona, and I'm Angeline, and I'm here in Berlin with Women Ed DE and Germany, and we couldn't host our face-to-face events due to the pandemic. And then all of the leaders from the different networks and started to meet up on Zoom and having some afternoon teas together. And then we decided, oh, well, wow, maybe we could start some webinars and find a different way to connect online with the Women Ed community and more. And so even if you're not part of the Women Ed community in your local area, it's great to have you along as well. And I would like to begin then by explaining a little bit for those of you who are not familiar with Women Ed about what we are. So Women Ed is a global grassroots movement which connects existing and aspiring leaders in education. So as you know, women dominate the educational field, but when it comes to women in educational leadership, and it's not the same. The numbers are nowhere near what it reflects, which is about a 70% general global average of women in education. But when it comes to leadership, the numbers are significantly lower. And so Women Ed kind of grew from a Twitter hashtag into 30 different networks around the globe. So just a few housekeeping notes in our webinar. We can't hear you, but we can read you. So do let us know what you're thinking via the chat, and use the Q&A function to post any of your burning questions. And as you're chatting, please make sure that you set it to reply to all panelists and attendees so that we can all see. And feel free to, of course, interact with each other as well, as we see some of you already starting to connect with each other. We will not be using the raise your hand feature on this webinar, so do make sure you do use the Q&A function. There will be a recording of this session. It's posting live now onto YouTube, and also engage with us in our community using the hashtags WomenEd and hashtag Heart2Heart. And you can see there are the Twitter handles from all of us who are on the panel today. So we have Doline Ndorimana, and Heidi Bachmann, and so Heidi Five Wings is her Twitter handle, and so I'm Ange Au, and we have Kyra Kellawan as well. So make sure you connect with us and share with us your thoughts either in the chat or via Twitter. So I'd like to introduce our panelists as well. So we have Doline Ndorimana. She's an EAL and French teacher from ISL Luxembourg, and she comes to us from sunny Burundi, although I think she's lived overseas for quite a number of years already. And so she's an international educator and uni lecturer. She has 14 years experience in different international business schools, and she sits on the, it's called a SIG group, so a special interest group for the Educational Collaborative of International Schools, so that's ECIS, the MLIE group, which is about multilingual learning in international education. So if you are an additional language teacher or a language teacher, so if you're, well, and we are all language teachers, so if you if you haven't heard of the ECIS MLIE, they have a fantastic virtual conference that's coming up soon as well. So do check that out. And Doline's also a CIS accreditation evaluator. She's part of WomenEdBeLux with Nancy and Claire and Ibti, and hopefully I haven't missed anyone, but I think there's a great group there in WomenEdBeLux. And she also runs the TED Ed Club at her school and is involved with Learning 2 and the Google Summit as a workshop leader. So welcome, Doline.
Thank you. Great, glad to be here.
Yeah, so glad you could make it. Thank you for joining us. And Heidi Bachmann is a part of our WomenEdDE network. So she's now just joined as a fresh member of our regional team in Munich, Bayern. And Heidi has grown up all around the world. She's a third culture kid, having lived in the UK, Belgium, Germany, the US. And she's worked a lot in the US in independent public charter and international schools, both in Washington, New York, and in Oakland. And she's also held many different posts as well. And her current post is as the lower school principal at the International School of Ulm and Neu-Ulm, which is in the south in Bavaria. And so she's an inclusion and special education specialist. And after interacting with Heidi a little bit, she also revealed to me her background with diversity and inclusion, which is why we've invited her to join us in this panel today. So do connect with Heidi as well at Heidify Wings on Twitter. So WomenEd's mission really is to make sure that more women, more women in education have a choice to progress on their leadership journey. So you can see from the images that are used all throughout WomenEd here about where when men have a kind of like a, I guess the feeling is, and the statistics show us as well, that when men have this kind of path that doesn't have as many barriers, whether they're internal or external or systemic as well. And so the rise for the top for women feels more like rock climbing than it is using a ladder. And another image I found that I have often used in WomenEdDE events is that kind of goes to that argument where, well, are we a meritocracy? So are we looking for people with merit? Yeah. And so the thing is, like, although if we're all starting off with merit, and what are we saying about the 70% of women who are in education? Do they not have the merit, but are there actually other barriers that just exist because we are women or identify as women as well? And so WomenEd is really about making sure that more women in education have a choice to progress on their leadership journey if that is what they so choose. Okay, because there are also women in education who may not want to, and that's also to be respected as well. And one of the new campaigns of WomenEd was to increase representation in leadership roles of women. So yeah, so one of the campaigns that has always been at WomenEd was to increase the representation of women in leadership roles. And I wanted to just share a little bit of information that I found as well. This was published by CIS, the Council of International Schools. And many of us on the panel, well, all of us on the panel here have worked in international schools, and some of us are currently still doing so. And when CIS they conduct a heads of school survey yearly. And in this particular year, in 2018, 243 men responded, and out of that, 180 were men and 63 were women. So only 26% of respondents are heads of schools are women. And the male heads of schools are paid 23% more than their female counterparts. Jane Larson, who is the CEO of CIS, also shared with me that they ran the same survey the year after, and hoping that the numbers would improve, but they didn't. They actually got worse. So it's interesting to think about that. And she also went back, they also went back at CIS, and they went back and asked the schools, since there is a gap, they thought, well, should we look at maybe the years of experience of these heads, the years of education that these heads had, and the years of experience maybe they had in their actual current school, but actually the gap persisted across all the factors. So even if the women were equally as qualified, there was still a gap as well.
And as we have Jane as an audience member and saw her sign in, if she would like to type in any comments about this particular piece of research, you're more than welcome to, Jane. We'd love to hear them.
Thank you. Oh, that's great. I can't see this chats while I'm sharing my screen with
That's fine. That's why I'm here.
It's great to hear that everyone's there. Welcome, everybody. So looking at this information and then thinking about, okay, so that's just men and women. And so another campaign of Women Ed is to increase the representation of BAME women in leadership roles. And Women Ed first started in the UK. It was a grassroots movement that started from there. And when I first saw this, I had to ask myself, what does BAME stand for? I wasn't familiar with this term, to be honest. And so I've since learned that it's Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups, and there's been a bit of a debate about the terms that we use and labels. Maybe some of our panelists, so we were having a bit of a conversation before, if you'd like to chime in about your thoughts on this. Heidi?
Well, yes, I was really interested in this because I think it's something that we have to sort of be brave about saying sometimes, that we don't know and that we're uncomfortable and that we might not always understand how to use the right wording, and we need to ask. Simply, we need to ask the people we're talking about, the people we're talking to, what do they prefer, how do they want us to handle certain things, but we need to not be afraid of kind of floundering in it. We need to kind of be open about it, I think.
Yeah, and as we were planning for this evening session, you know, I reached out to Doline and I said, are you comfortable if we use the term women of color? And what are your thoughts on that, Doline?
You know, I just wanted to share something that I've done with my students, because they always had a problem to say that I'm Black. And I did a little exercise where a colleague of mine said, well, how would you describe Miss Ndorimana? And they use all these kinds of adjectives and everything, but they never said that I was Black. So then I went to see them and I said, well, what if I go missing? I just hope that the first thing you're gonna say is that I'm Black so they can find me, right? So then this is how I started the conversation with them, saying that if you don't use personally, and I'm not speaking for all Black people, this is just for me personally, if I feel like if you don't use the word Black, it becomes ugly. It's like something bad, and it shouldn't be something bad. So for me, I embrace it, and I think it's beautiful, just like white or another color. And I think it's important that we use the words.
Yeah, it's something. I did a project once with 6th graders where we had descriptors of humans, adjectives describing ourselves, and we used rocks. It was based on a Jessica Biel's art installation, and each rock had a different descriptor on it, and one of the words said fat, and one of them said skinny and something else, and I had the word fat next to my head as I made a haiku of myself. And my students were like, why would you put that next to your head? Because it's a descriptor of me. It's not a bad word. We're providing judgment to words that don't exist necessarily, and we need to be much more open and honest about what we're comfortable with and what we're uncomfortable with, and how we have these discussions and these descriptors, particularly when it comes to these issues of diversity. We cannot hide from them. We cannot pretend they don't exist. We have to face them head on, and we have to be willing to help children and our students face them head on as well, and be able to have the discussions about what might be perceived as difficult language.
Yeah, so perhaps in the audience, if you want to share your thoughts on this, and maybe share with us what are the terms that you're using in school, or maybe also sharing your story, like how Doline has, of how she's used something in school to help address this, and any practical strategies you might have to think about.
I just want to add something in, Angeline, and I think it speaks to, you know, the first point about just being questioning, right? Just being open to listen to what people's preferences are, because, you know, I'm somebody who passes for white, even though I'm of mixed heritages. And so I think it's really important to ask what people feel they want to be referred to as, what they identify as, and also to be sure that you're not deciding for someone just based on their appearance, because, you know, there's a lot of hidden depths to people. Heidi will know that as a third culture kid. All of our panelists will know that as people who are living outside of the context that we were raised in. And so I think it's really important to just, you know, be open to ask those questions. I think, you know, we're seeing a lot of that coming through in the chat now.
Yeah. And I think also for me, like a term can be used in also a negative way, and in the another breath, a positive way. So even if you do have a term that everyone has a common understanding of, and that is being used, it also, the way in which it's being used, I think, is sometimes more problematic than the term itself, right? Okay. Yeah. So thanks for that conversation. It's great to get that out in the air, because I think it's a really controversial thing, but also something that we all need to be comfortable with having those conversations. Although then we might feel that they're difficult, they're necessary, and it's a way for all of us to move forward. Because if we can't name the problem, how are we going to talk about it? Yeah. And one of the people who published some information that I wanted to share with you came from the McKinsey report in 2019. It was published by the Female Quotient on Twitter. And it looked at the representation of women and how this shrinks as their careers advance. And the only group that's growing here are white men. And if you can see, men of color who enter the workforce there, by the time they get to a C-level position, it's at 10%. But then when you look at the women there, you have white women and women of color. And although women of color, I think it's starting there at 18%, it's going all the way down to 14% by the time it gets to the C-level. And that is like less than even a quarter of people who are starting in that. And so while we're seeing that there are issues with men and women in terms of rising in educational leadership, we're also seeing it for people of color as well. And this survey is more in like the business world, but all of the people in the business world have come from education and our schools and our schooling systems. And so what are the messages that we're giving that makes this really systemic throughout everywhere else? And when I read this, it made me think about that. Another thing I found recently that I wanted to share was it's called the Educational Digest of International, and one of the articles in there was titled "White Anglo-Saxon Males Dominate International Education Leadership," and it was written by Dr. Stephen Whitehead, who is a lecturer. He was a lecturer, he's retired now, but he worked a lot with gender identity and about masculinity, and he was also a head of school in an area that was very diverse in the UK. And he went on his own journey as a white male, working in a place where there was a lot of diverse people. And in one of his articles that I just mentioned, he wrote that it was curious that he tried to find out information about what boards look like in education. So these are snapshots of some of the different boards of school groups that he mentioned. And this is not to say, like, I've actually worked for some of these people in the picture here. I've been on, accreditation teams with some of the people in the picture here. I have a lot of respect for a lot of people in these pictures, and it's not to say that any of this is bad, but when I looked at representation here, it was really hard to find. And I was kind of getting quite disheartened as I was starting to put this slide together. And then even when I went to the Association of African International Schools, there was 1 out of 9 people in that picture that was a visible woman of color. Yeah, and so that really hit me, and to think about, well, and that's also even in Africa, where I'm sure that's not reflective of the population, and that's, yeah, that really struck me, as by the time I put all that visual together, it was wow. And so having a panel like this, I think, is very important. I'd like to just read a little bit of what he wrote. He wrote, finding a black or brown face among the white males who dominate international education is like searching for a pearl oyster in the River Mersey, was his words as well. So, yeah. Another piece of information I found really interesting, there was actually a bit of research done by Lauren Bales and Sarah Guthrie, and it was titled, they published an article titled "Held Down and Held Back, Systemically Delayed Principal Promotions by Race and Gender." So what we're looking at here is when males are promoted to an assistant principalship, they spend X amount of time at that level before they get promoted into a principal position. And so what they're finding is that males might stay at that deputy assistant principal role for 4.94 years, and females will stay there for longer before they move to the next step. And when they looked at white and blacks, there was again a disparity. And so the likelihood of promotion for women decreases relative to males, and men's promotion rates are 5 to 7% higher than women's. And they tested for the possibility that the double identified, so if you're identifying as both a woman and black, you could further lengthen the average tenure of of you holding that position as assistant principal. And so, that is, in some ways, we're kind of being shown data that at our hearts we kind of know it's true, right? And we have a feeling about that already. And so I searched for this, and if you know of any other bits of information, data that you could share with us as well, please do put it into the chat and share with us, and we'll try and collate those together to share with the wider community. So I think I have talked too much, and I wanted to ask now, what's resonated with you? What has been your journey? So perhaps Doline, could you share a little about your leadership path story with us?
Yes, thank you. Well, I don't have a very long journey. I feel like I'm still, in the journey, and I started recently. But I think it hasn't been easy. I think as a woman, it's not always easy. And as a woman of color, it gets a little bit more complicated. I've missed, I will say, opportunity, some opportunity, because I think, I believe it was fairly done. I believe I wasn't ready. And there were other opportunities that I felt were clearly not, it wasn't a fair game. So pretty early, I understood that that injustice was going to be part of my journey, and I had to work with it. And but one thing that happened down the road, I sort of realized that some of the people who are on the table that I wanted to be, and I wasn't there, were not very deserving to be on that table. And so it sort of shifted, and I realized that leadership is more than the title. It goes beyond the title. And there are people who have titles that are not great leaders. Those who have titles are great leaders, and there are great leaders with no titles. So it sort of shifted, and I stopped chasing the position, and I focused more on people. How do you make a positive impact on people? How do you make people excited to join your initiative, your projects? How do you create a space where kids thrive, where colleagues want to be part of change? And that's what I've been working on, and one of my biggest missions, so to say, I see myself as a leader. So one of my biggest mission is to create a culture of vulnerability, where we talk about, things that are not easy to talk, where we get comfortable with the uncomfortable, so to say. And that's what I've been doing with the TED Club, and it has expanded beyond the club. And now we're getting teachers coming and sharing their stories of vulnerability, of failure, or, so I'm still in my journey, but I think I have found my purpose, which is, I think it's very important for me. And it still isn't easy. But also one thing I think was important is, once I focus on, I think, what matter, then interestingly enough, the title started to come. So that was that's where I am now, and I'm excited about it.
Doline, that leads us to a really lovely audience question, which is very related. And I think, you've just told us about your own experience, but maybe you can speak to the best ways to get involved in other leadership projects. You mentioned the TED Club as one of yours. Emma Goth has asked about events or roles outside of school that might be possible to also develop leadership skills and to develop experience with leadership?
Yeah. So I very much like that question, because that question resonated with me. I think, you know, for so many teachers, especially teachers that I know of color, I mean, people of color, we try our best, we worked, we do the best we can possibly do. And then we hope for, you know, that someone recognize our work. And then sometimes it doesn't happen. And then you're stuck, you don't know where to go. You don't know what other, you know, doors, you know, to knock on. And one thing that has helped me, for me, is having an amazing woman. I'm sorry, but I have to tell her, I have to mention her name because she's there, Nancy Schicciarini, who really have become, you know, has been a great mentor for me, and who has shown me, okay, there is another way of doing it. You know, she told me about the ECIS group, told me about, you know, the CIS accreditation, all these things that I didn't know existed. So when you have a woman who is already in leadership, who has a network, and you are lucky to have her saying, okay, you can have that, because these are things that we don't have. We don't have access to that network. We don't have access to these groups, ECIS, CIS. We don't know we know they exist, but we don't know what are the potential. We don't know. I personally didn't know that I could even be a consultant, so to say. So this is, for me, it's so important, because I think as a woman, if you are up there and you have, you know, power and position, I think it's so important that you look at another woman who's, you know, who has potential, and that you help her by opening those doors that for us are almost, we don't know them. So I think that's really, really, really important.
I so resonate with what you're saying, Doline, because I think one of the things that is innately part of being a woman is that we are about community and relationships. And sometimes that can be to our detriment, in that sense of, you know, I think particularly teachers a lot of us want to be in our classrooms with our students, and leaving the classroom and leaving that community and leaving that place which is really comfortable to us, where we can build those relationships, and taking that leap into leadership is really scary at times. And it's finding those slightly alternative routes that women can actually do so well, because we are very creative and we build those creative and different kind of pathways. But you know, my pathway was a little bit different than yours, and so it's like figuring out how our pathways provide different entry points. As a white woman, I have not faced some of the same issues you face, but as a woman, I face those ideas of motherhood and timing in my life, and how I will have children and be part of an educational leadership experience. And I found exactly what you're talking about outside the traditional pathway. This is my first principalship, and I'm 55. So I've come a very different route. I've been in education for over 30 years, and I've been a leader, but in different ways. And teaching at the university level, I've done a lot of professional development for teachers, but it was these baby steps that kind of brought me to that. And as other women who supported me, and some men as well, who gave me this idea of, you know, why don't you do a workshop on this particular subject? Well, I don't know how to do that workshop. No, you can do that workshop. Just try it. And I'm trying to find ways for my own staff to do the same thing. You know, you've never done a workshop before, do one. Go to this conference, present yourself, think about it, take that leap. And it is finding those small moments to begin that path. And exactly what you were talking about with the mentorship too. So important to find other women and people of color, if that's what you're looking for in your life, is to find that person who can help you understand, I tried this worked for me, give it a try, or these are the organizations to go to. So all of those alternative routes are really, really valuable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And sorry.
Go on, Doline.
I just wanted to say that it's extremely important, because sometimes it's very disheartening. You know, you try and you try and you try and you feel like you can't. And that's how, for some people, I don't know if it's the right word, the kind of the light sort of, you know, dimmed. Do you say that? And that passion starting disappearing. And I know a lot of people who have given up on education because of that, because they don't see any way out. So I think as women, mentorship is extremely important.
It really is. And I think it's one of those things too, where we we don't always know where to find them. We think that our bosses can be our leaders and our mentors. Some of them can, some of them are very capable of that, but it's actually sometimes outside that arena that we find the people who can really nurture us in that way. And it's connecting, and even things like Women Ed, having those moments of just meeting other people who are maybe not in your position, but are doing things that you aspire to.
Yeah, so being able to find mentors and so Doline, you were lucky to have Nancy, I think, in your school as well. There was another question from Laurie Green, and she asked, how can we find mentors to help us get to leadership roles? Any suggestions, Heidi?
Yeah, I mean, my first suggestion would be, what is your passion in terms of, we're talking education here, teaching. So if you have a particular passion for teaching, for me, I was a history major, but I found I loved science and I loved teaching science. And a professor of mine in my undergraduate and in my graduate experience kind of led me to a path where I started actually consulting and getting to know a science kit maker at the Lawrence Hall of Science. And those people became my mentors in science education. And I had never, ever thought I could teach science. It was not my subject, and I found a passion for it. And I found a particular professor who just said, go for it. You know, you love children, you understand child development, you're interested in the natural world. Let's put these two things together and see how you can start teaching it. So outside of your school, what are you passionate about? Those are places to find some leaders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for myself personally, I find that I've always turned to people who I ask for some advice even. So a mentor may not necessarily have to be long term, but depending on what your attention is at the time, there may be different people you might turn to within your network that you start to expand that are, you know, mentors for a time, right? and then so that's like a mentorship. I think that can be really useful. But there's also another element is the concept of having an executive sponsor. And so someone who is going to help you, you know, on your leadership path, you know, so someone who's like looking at that, oh, well, there's an opportunity, there's something, and pointing out those areas that may not necessarily go with a title, but also with the opportunities for you to show and develop your leadership skills.
Well, you should have multiple mentors, really. I mean, you know, you're going to have mentors that you may think might not actually be mentors, people that you can trust and ask those questions of. And then you might have people in your professional life, in your personal life. So we all need those multiple people. And I would just say right now, don't be afraid to email strangers. Don't be afraid to find their contact information online and email them and say, I have this question. I saw you on this video or whatever, and I'm interested in talking with you about you sharing your experience with me.
Yeah, some of the comments coming in are really echoing what you're all saying. I mean, I think one of the things is not to think small. To always have that kind of, you know, dream person that you would like to approach. And you know, Leanne has commented that she approached a woman she admired who was delivering a conference, couldn't believe it when she said yes. And I have had very similar experiences, especially during lockdown, because guess what? We were all at home with nothing to do for a time. I mean, we had things to do, but we didn't have places to be. And so that meant that the very important among us that we have held up as our, you know, our dream mentors, we're usually free to respond to an email or to jump on a call. So, you know, I would say take the risk in asking someone that you think is far beyond. Don't just go for the person who's in a similar role to you, although there is great support in that as well, in having somebody who can understand your day-to-day challenges, but someone who can also nudge you beyond the space that you're in. So we've gotten some great examples of different connections that people can make online using ECIS Connect. I know you can see them all in the comments, so I'll let you move to the next question, Angeline.
Sure. But I think one way, of course, is you know, using your voice and getting yourself out there is something that you've done, Doline, in response to the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Movement that has been reignited, let's say, and given a more of a global media stage right now. And so I wanted to ask you, Doline, in the letter published by ECIS, you wrote that, and if you don't mind me reading what you wrote. Yeah. So you wrote, these last weeks of protest around the world has given me new hope. To see young people angry and determined to demand change has brought me hope. To see that the world is finally paying attention to us is bringing me hope. To see many colleagues reading and learning about racism and racial discrimination is giving me hope. most importantly, to hear my own students saying, "Miss, what's your story? I had no clue," or "What can we really do as young people?" is truly bringing me hope. So I wanted to ask you, Doline, how has the community responded to your letter? And have these responses affirmed, diminished, or perhaps reignited your hope?
Well, thank you, Angeline. The response has been really great. I mean, the support from the school, the colleagues, seeing so many teachers, you know, putting the Black Lives Matter T-shirts every Thursday, it was great. But I must say that I think for me, the best response has been, we put together, this was student driven from the TED Club, because we've been working a lot about being comfortable with the uncomfortable. Let's talk about things that are not easy to talk about. That has been one of my main mission. And when the whole thing happened, a group of students came and say, we have to do something, we have to talk about it. So I helped them, but they approached our teachers who are, you know, from the minority. And bear with me, we put a webinar together, and there were 6 panelists, and we had a male teacher from Kenya, a male African-American teacher, female African-American, and then we had a grade 11 student who's from Morocco. We had a British Caribbean male teacher, and then we had a white woman who has adopted 2 Black boys. And they all share their stories and the strength that they had to be, you know, showing their vulnerability. And for most of them, it was actually the first time they share their stories. And that was the biggest impact that I was looking for, because it just brought things home to my colleagues, to the school community, where they realized that this is not far, this is not in the States, this is actually here. These are the people we work with. And so one of the most beautiful thing that is happening now in our school, and I really believe is because of this story sharing, is that now you have teachers coming together, working on the curriculum, thinking about how do we create space. And that to me was the best thing, because now it's not, people are looking for sustainable change, not just a fix, but something that will stay. And that's, again, the power of sharing stories and being comfortable with the uncomfortable and talking about things that are not easy to talk about. So that was the most beautiful thing that happened after the letter and everything else. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and it's great. And if you're not familiar with Doline's Twitter feed, you must go on there, because she's posting some of these evidence of some of these stories also on Twitter that I've been following you and looking at, and it's great. So you're sharing the results of what's happening in those conversations that can spark some different ideas for other people in their schools as well. Thank you. And you also followed up with another letter, and it was addressed, "Dear white heads of schools," where you asked, as a head of school, what have you done in your school to promote or encourage your community to start their anti-racism journey? So here we have Heidi, a white head of school, and I want to give you a chance, Heidi, to respond to this. So as a leader in a school with a background in diversity and inclusion, can you share with us what you have done or are planning to do?
Yes, I mean, so this is my 2nd year at ISU, and we are a very small school in Ulm, which is in southern Germany. And our population is not incredibly diverse in terms of race, although to some extent it is, but it is incredibly diverse in terms of nationality and international culture and language. And so one of the things we've started really talking about is how we bring in children's literature to reflect the world population. And we're really looking at our library, we're looking at our classroom libraries, we're looking at the books that we use, that we take for granted, that we may have been using for years, that might not actually reflect our world in a way that we want to. And so I'm challenging my teachers to really take a look at their personal libraries in their classrooms, and for us to look at how we add new literature to reflect better not only racial diversity, diversity of all kinds, and be inclusive, but a lot about also family inclusivity, language inclusivity, representing different disabilities, just all different kinds of inclusion on a bigger scale, and that we really take a close look at the messages that we're sending through our literature that we use, and what we want to, are the books really showing our values? And it sounds like maybe perhaps a small thing, but I think it's actually quite an insidious, big thing that has to do with every layer of what we have in our classrooms and how we present things to children. The other thing I'm trying to do is, we're a PYP school and IB PYP school, so I'm really looking at the learner profile, and during assemblies, I'm trying to bring up learner profile stories that emulate what is happening in our community, and that we talk about what these learner profiles mean from an inclusive perspective. How are we including children and each other and families into what we're doing? So that's one aspect of things. The other aspect is about hiring and really looking at what we are doing in hiring. We've just gone through our accreditation process. We just uploading everything. We have our visit next year. And it really has allowed us, the self-study, to look at what are we doing with our staff? How are we providing diverse opportunities for recruitment? How are we providing diverse opportunities for leadership, the path to leadership in our school? What are we doing to maintain and retain teachers? We are a tiny school, and we don't have a ton of turnover, which is a great thing, but it also means we have to, every single position matters in this regard. And so it's discussions that we're starting to have on our leadership team about how are we being creative in this viewpoint. And it's something that we talked earlier about before we started, about the recruitment process and hiring. And it is I think we have to look at some different pathways, frankly. And that's something that I'm starting to look at, is how do we find teachers locally? How do we find teachers internationally who represent more of the world?
Yeah, and I know we have representatives from within the different hiring organizations in the talk watching now, so I'm sure there will be some comments flashing up in a second. But I wanted to ask a question from Anita Sarkar, who basically said, how do we raise and address institutional and systemic racism without breaking our organization? So what you've explained there is an organization that's obviously flexible and willing to look at itself. What about if these changes wreak havoc? What would you suggest to organizers who are trying to reach communities in their schools that may be resistant to these changes?
Do you want me to start?
Sure, either of you.
I think this is the challenge, right? I mean, I can't say that my organization has it perfectly figured out. We don't. We're definitely struggling ourselves. I've been in education for 30 years. I started in New York City. Then I moved to Oakland, California. Then I worked in Washington, D.C. All very diverse neighborhoods and diverse school systems. And I would say that I've been having this conversation for 30 years. And part of it is we need to be braver about saying, why are we hiring somebody? What is the criteria we're using? And what does it mean to make a statement, in a sense, of hiring this person versus this person? And it is a very, very difficult thing for school leadership to sometimes face, the difficult conversation of, we use the excuse, oh, we hired the best person for the job. I hear that a lot. And it kind of covers a multitude of sins, frankly. And I feel like we have to get honest about the different pathways to experience, the different pathways to knowledge, and what it is we're actually really looking for in leaders, in teachers, in people who are joining our school and our staff. And we are not necessarily, I come from an independent school background and an international school background in the USA and now in Europe. And I feel like I know NAIS, the National Association of Independent Schools in America, has worked on these questions for a long time. The People of Color conferences that they have, the POCC conferences, are amazing. But they're still not solving the problems. The statistics speak for themselves. We're not there. And so we have to be braver. We have to be more honest. We have to be more clear that this is something absolutely worth being uncomfortable about. And we have to talk to all of our stakeholders about this, our board members, our staff, our funders, everybody. And we have to be held accountable. I heard Jane Larson speak in your last Heart to Heart about accountability, and it really resonated for me, because that is absolutely part of this. Unfortunately, if institutions aren't held accountable, it slips through the cracks. It doesn't happen. So we need to hold ourselves accountable.
Right, and so that's what I want to ask a little bit there about the current context. Then you've explained the context in your school, Heidi. Doline, has the work have you felt that the work has fallen to you to raise the issues, or has that been happening from your leadership team? And if we are in school settings where, you know, the noises aren't being made in the right places, then a lot of our guests today are asking, how do we start that? And I think, you know, you tacked on the bravery comment, Heidi. We do need to be braver. We do need to be ready to be uncomfortable. But, you know, is this work falling to just a few people in each school?
Can I just first go back to what Heidi was saying? I've been thinking about this actually for a couple of weeks now. And I think especially in international school, I think we have to start with global citizenship. What is global citizenship? I think that's the big one. I mean, we are international school, global citizenship is one of the main pillars of accreditation. But when I'm looking at, even for me, I just went through the accreditation, you know, training. And when we were unpacking what is global citizenship, it's very vague. And I think once we start unpacking what is global citizenship, how does it look like? You know, what does a global citizen look like, think like? You know, maybe if we stop there, then we will probably be forced to look into recruitment, to look into curriculum, to look into, so I think global citizenship is really, for me, is where we can start, because we're not there. I don't understand what it is, and I don't think that it's very clear for international school. So that's just where I got stuck, where I was unpacking it, and I just couldn't, it wasn't clear, and it's not clear for everyone, I think. So
I so agree with you.
You mentioned in your classrooms, you know, the students were driving this conversation forward, and I think we've seen in a lot of communications doing the rounds in the international school networks that there are many student-led initiatives that are happening that I think give me hope personally to create the conversations even when the educators themselves have not been proactive enough. What have been your experiences there? Maybe over to Doline in that regard.
With the students, you mean?
Yeah.
So this is where I have hope. This is where my hope becomes this. You know, in my school, for instance, when I saw the emails that I received during quarantine from students saying, we have to do something, we've called the commune, we've done this and we've done that. That's I think where we have a great chance of influencing the adults, because when it's student driven, when it's the student saying we need that, it's kind of hard for the adults to say, no, we're not going to do that, because it's their school and it's student voice. So there is a lot of initiative going on in our school with the global issues, with what's the word, gender inequality. So there is a lot going on, and I think as adults we have to be behind them, and that's what I always try to tell my kids, my students. I said, you want to do something, you go for it. I'm just gonna help you, but you have to do it. And I think it's always hard for administration and principals to say no when you have a group of students who have come up with a proposal and say, this is what we want to do. So
absolutely. And the alumni voice is very powerful here too. Yeah.
Certainly in IB schools too, this idea of action and agency is so critical. And if we're authentic to that, then we need to be listening to our students and we need to be supporting them for sure.
Yeah, so I think we've touched on quite a few things. So if we're looking at also, I think, you know, personal journeys and conversations that we have and stories that we're listening to that are challenging us and expanding the way in which we think and look at different things, and also some institutional things that need to happen in our schools as well. And so it sounds like there are different shifts in thinking and as well that need to happen, because even if you do have, you know, policies and procedures that are happening, or accreditation things that we're working towards, so sometimes it might look good on paper, But if your culture doesn't reflect that in your schools and people are still thinking in limited ways, then that's also not going to make a difference. And so I think a balance of those two things as well. But I wanted to pick up on let's talk a little bit about recruiting, because we've had some questions from educators in schools and who work in recruiting roles for ISS and with TIE, interested in our perspectives on recruitment and retention. So Pauline O'Brien, for example, and Brittany Betts, they asked about hiring for diversity, what needs to change, and you know, how recruiters can best provide support and be proactive. So I'd like to share with you Audrey Pantelis's question that I think captures these ideas in one. So she asked, how does the recruitment process ensure that women from diverse backgrounds are attracted to leadership positions, and how are they supported once they are appointed?
Oh, goodness.
Good question.
So I will say that it took a lot of persuading in my own life, my personal life, to actually make the leap to be a principal. I avoided it because I felt like it was not really a supported position very well for women. And I kind of just didn't really know that I wanted to do that kind of leadership. I'm really happy now and I'm loving it. And I think it's important. I think there are a few barriers, and I'll be really upfront here. I think the check boxes on the recruitment websites where you check all the acronyms of all the things that you've done or been part of or understand or, you know, whatever, they can be misleading about who you really are as an educator. I don't tick some of those boxes, and yet my wealth of experience is not necessarily boxable, but it fits with a PYP, or it fits with an IGCSE, or it fits with all these different acronyms. And I think that's particularly true for folks and people who have had different alternative routes to coming to where they are. And that we may have also just stayed in one particular kind of educational experience and not ventured out of that because it's been hard to make that leap, and we only then tick one box. So I feel like there needs to be ways to, and then there are some ways, I mean, personal statements help, and there are obviously interviews, but occasionally I think not having ticked that box puts you out of the running from the get-go.
I agree.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the people designing these boxes, so social systems are designed by humanity, right? So there are biases and values of the people designing what goes into those questionnaires and what goes into that are setting up those expectations. So I think yeah, that's a really good point about the way in which recruiting is done. Doline, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I completely agree with Heidi. And personally, there are some jobs that I never apply for because of some specifics that were there. And I think it's something that is very, very important to look at. And I think it also goes beyond what is on the box, but also, the problem with passport as well. If you don't have the right passport, it's a problem. And
did we lose Doline?
Oh yes, she might have frozen there. Hopefully she'll come back. But that's such a good point about nationality and passport.
Jane also mentioned that in your webinar with her about the qualifications, and having, that at some point we need to get better internationally about allowing each other's qualifications in different countries, because it can be a huge barrier. I know in Germany at the moment, just hiring teachers from different places, I cannot actually teach in Germany with my qualifications, but I could be a principal. It's a very strange thing. So I think that we have to look at some of those pathways, particularly from the international school perspective, but also just how we support educational leadership worldwide.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely, I think, a complex thing to answer as well, because there are so many different factors that go into that. Because even once we get people who represent different, cross-section of society into our schools, how do we retain them? And is the place actually a welcoming place for them to work in and thrive? Yeah. So and what is the intent also with that hiring? So are people getting on the bandwagon now and saying, oh, I want to hire this and this, but then all of a sudden when they get in there, they're not actually the school itself is not having these conversations, or they're not actually supporting and promoting people who are representing different minority ethnic groups. Doline, welcome back.
It looks like Doline's back. I was just going to say.
Yay.
My Wi-Fi broke, sorry.
No problem.
I'm back.
So
yeah.
I'm going to ask, as we're coming close to the end of the hour, I'm going to ask about resources, if that's okay. So if we could have a quick sort of, signposting really from the two panelists that we have here today. Which resources do you think educators should be reaching for at the moment? And maybe you'd like to signpost to any resources that have been really useful for you, that you have also produced, or that you have just felt have added to the conversation in a positive way that maybe you can recommend to some of our guests today.
Doline, do you want to start?
Can I ask what kind of resources? Any resources about the representation of women, or?
Yes, representation of women, conversations about hiring practices, other open letters that you have read that have resonated with you, things that people might want to add to their bookmarks, or just people that you'd like to name check who are influencing the discussion in a positive way for you.
Yeah, well, one thing that I have recommended to my friends, and that I think is to take a moment and sort of reflect on ourselves and ask ourselves why we are still having that conversation. Like Heidi said, we've been having this conversation for 30 years. and so there were a couple of books, maybe there is one by Kendi, Ibrahim X Kendi.
Yes.
What is it called? There was one, Stamped, and How to Be an Anti-Racist, I think. Those are two books that I think have had a huge impact on people that I recommend it to. Mm-hmm. And also, I think it's very important, if you have a person of color that you know, just talk to them, ask the question. I mean, most of people will be, happy to have these conversations with you. If you have someone in your school and you're afraid to go to because you think it's uncomfortable, I think it's actually worse not to approach them, because then they feel, again, you can feel like, well, these things are happening, but people are not talking about it. And if it's uncomfortable, just tell them, I might say something uncomfortable, I might say the wrong thing, but I'm here because I want to learn. And so I think it's if you have that opportunity, it's important that you ask, that you go and have a chat. Yeah.
Thank you. Any resources that have chimed for you, Heidi, as well?
Oh my gosh, I have to say there's a lot. But just recently, the Diversity Collaborative that came out of ISS, I thought their papers were really quite inspiring for me as a leader in international education. There's a lot on there for principals and leaderships and boards to look at and really think about. So I really appreciated their publications recently. I want to speak to a couple things. I'm American. So a lot of the resources, and in America, we are obviously heavily grappling with these questions and issues, but not just about women in leadership, but about racism and anti-racist work, and really thinking about the teaching and learning piece, as well as the leadership piece. So a couple of organizations, the National Association of Independent Schools, the People of Color Conference, is something that I think every human being should go to if they work with children and adults. It's an amazing resource. And if you ever get a chance to go to their conference, do it. I would also say that Teaching Tolerance is a really great website, and Teaching for Change are two American websites that have curricular information, but they also have teacher leader information. And then EastEd is an organization in the US, which is specifically about diversity and inclusion at independent schools, which I think has a lot to offer international schools as well. And they've been really working on it. Randolph Carter is somebody I know quite well who's been working in this area for quite some time. And he's a great resource, as well as his wife, Elizabeth Denevi. So those are some resources, and we can maybe write them up at some point. And the last thing I would say from a sort of a maybe left field area is Agency by Design, which is a Project Zero think tank, part of a Project Zero think tank, is really working on social justice from a maker perspective, and how to look at systems and looking at systemic racism from a very concrete way with students, from very young students in kindergarten all the way up to college level and adults, And I've been a Project Zero follower and have done conferences for them and been a presenter for them. And I have to say, it's an out-of-the-box way of looking at systemic racism. And it really helps you examine the systems and looking at systems theory with children. And it helps, I think, even with your faculty meetings and in ways of kind of expanding your thinking about how to have these conversations using physical materials and building and examining different processes and using different thinking routines. So that's my beginning resource list.
Can I add one more thing? I know we have to go.
Of course.
I think TIE Online has done a great job amplifying, voices of international educators who are Black or from minority. And some of the stories and testimonies are absolutely amazing. So that's also one thing that could be added on the list.
Yes, thank you, Doline. They actually asked a question saying, how can we help to amplify your voices and forward your work? So of course, if there's anyone watching who also would like to contribute, I know that they've been very supportive recently, as well as the ALOC group that has been mentioned in the chat, which is being operated in the US by Kevin. I've forgotten his last name. Oh my God, it's just gone out of my head. Thank you. I knew it was an S. Kevin Simpson. And he has a team, I believe, of people working with him now.
Yeah.
We're going to save the resources and post them into the YouTube channel just to let everyone know who's asking.
Yes.
I have one last resource that I would say is a great read also is Deborah Rader's book, Intercultural Teaching and Learning for Intercultural Understanding. And we are going to be hosting a summer institute in July. It is July 24th and 25th, if I have my dates correct here, yes. And you can go to her website, deborahrader.com, to find more information. I'll be doing it, and Sarah Kupke from ISS, International School of Stuttgart. It's online, and we're keeping it to slightly small groups, so it'll be an intimate experience, but we're going to be continuing conversations like this. How do we do this work? How do we build inclusive schools? How do we foster diversity in all aspects and use a lot of children's literature to do it?
Thank you so much for all of those wonderful resources and wonderful opportunities for us all to connect. And like Kara mentioned, we're going to collate those and share them with you all, especially and also the ones that you're sharing amongst yourselves right now as well. And I'd like to end with just sharing a quote that kind of is like a bit of a mantra at WomenEd. It's from Margaret Mead, and it says that never doubt that a small group of concerned citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And I want to thank our panelists today who are changing the world in what they do right now in their schools and beyond, and as members of WomenEd. And if you like to join WomenEd and connect with a different WomenEd community, please do reach out to us at either WomenEd Germany, WomenEd Spain, or WomenEd Luxembourg, BeLux, Belgium, Luxembourg, I mean, as well. And if you have any resources that you think of that the community can really benefit from that you would like us to add to the list, those are our Gmails there as well, or you can contact us via Twitter. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.